The deadliest maritime accident in Irish history occurred at around 1 AM on the 8th of January 1979 at the Whiddy Island oil storage facility in Bantry Bay, Southern Ireland. During what was supposed to be the routine unloading of an oil tanker, a fire started on the offshore unloading jetty. The subsequent explosion tore the ship apart, the blast being of such force that it was heard up to 35 miles away. It was one of the worst industrial accidents that Ireland has ever seen. As demand for oil began to skyrocket during the 1960s and Western nations looked increasingly to supplies from the Middle East, the sight of giant oil supertankers, or ULCCs, became increasingly commonplace in shipping lanes around the world. Able to transport vast amounts of crude oil in a single voyage, these enormous vessels plied the globe, delivering their liquid cargo to ports all over the world. However, their enormous size presented a problem. Many of them were simply too large to enter the existing ports and estuaries. The solution was to create oil terminals located just offshore, where the oil could be unloaded and stored before being pumped to refineries onshore or transferred to smaller vessels for further onward travel. In 1966, the Gulf Oil Corporation chose Whiddy Island, located in Bantry Bay, as the location for their new European storage facility. The bay offered sheltered deep water, and the sparsely populated low-lying island looked to be an ideal site for the storage facility. By 1969, the facility was up and running. Tankers would berth alongside a concrete and metal jetty located offshore about 400 metres from the island and remain there while the oil was pumped off. The storage facility itself occupied the whole southwestern end of the island, boasting 17 large storage tanks capable of holding a total of 1.2 million tonnes of crude oil. Initially, the facility was a great success, boosting the local economy and providing ample storage for Europe's insatiable demand for oil. The largest vessel in the world, the Gulf-owned Universe Island, was a regular sight in Bantry Bay. There was even a 2-minute TV commercial celebrating the new depot, complete with a jaunty sea shanty called "Bringing Home the Oil," sung by the popular Irish folk band the Clancy Brothers. However, the boom times for Whiddy Island were not to last. By the mid to late 1970s, economic recession had led to a drop in demand for oil, and the expense of storing vast amounts of crude oil was becoming a heavy cost to bear. The Gulf Corporation implemented cost-cutting strategies to try and keep the Whiddy terminal economically viable, but the halcyon days of bringing home the oil seemed to be long gone. On January 6, 1979, the French-registered MV Betelgeuse, owned by the Total Oil Company, berthed at the jetty just off Whiddy Island to offload her cargo of 114,000 tonnes of light crude oil. She was a medium-sized tanker, 11 years old and nearing the end of her working life. Her voyage from the Persian Gulf had not been without incident. There had been delays, diversions, rough weather, and even an oil leak en route before the Betelgeuse had reached Whiddy Island. One eyewitness is quoted as saying that she looked like a real old rust bucket laid up at the jetty. The operation to unload her cargo was expected to take around 36 hours. During the first 24 hours, crew members enjoyed some shore leave before returning to the ship, as the Gulf Corporation employees changed shifts working out on the jetty. By midnight on Sunday the 7th of January, the unloading procedure was entering its final phase. At this time, there were 44 people on board the Betelgeuse and around half a dozen workers out on the jetty. At this point, details become a little confused as there are conflicting reports of what happened next. The account I relay here seems to be the most readily accepted version of events. At around 12:30 AM, a cracking sound was heard coming from within the structure of the ship, and a fire started. Burning oil began leaking from the ship into the water and onto the jetty. The sea around the tanker quickly set aflame, suggesting that she may have been leaking oil into the water for some time. There was some firefighting equipment on the jetty, foam-based spray hoses, but these could only be activated by the Whiddy Island watchkeeper, who was at the time absent from his post. The fact that the watchkeeper was absent also meant that no rescue vessel was sent out to the jetty. The nearest vessel was only 7 minutes away, but the request to evacuate the men from the burning jetty was never sent. Radio calls for help went unanswered in the terminal office. The firefighting tug, which should have been on standby next to the Betelgeuse, was instead berthed around the headland, some 20 minutes away and out of sight of the spreading fire. There was a big diesel water pump and hose located at one end of the jetty, but the access gate was locked, and no one on the jetty had a key. With no way to fight the flames, the only option was to flee, but escape was now impossible. The terrified crew were seen gathered at the stern of the burning vessel, but with the water around the ship on fire, jumping into the sea was not an option. Now originally, the jetty had been connected to the island by a steel footbridge, but this had been removed soon after the terminal became operational, so that 2 tankers could be berthed at the same time. It was a way of increasing profits. But with no connecting bridge, anyone who was now out on the ship or jetty was effectively trapped. They could only try to run from the encroaching flames and wait for a rescue that would never come. Just before 1 AM there was a huge explosion which literally tore the ship in two. Eyewitnesses described the entire vessel and jetty as being consumed within an enormous fireball. Huge chunks of red-hot metal began to rain down all over the storage facility. Panicked employees began scrambling to prevent fires breaking out around the storage tanks. Any thought of rescue for the crew of the Betelgeuse or the men out on the jetty were forgotten. It was clear that nobody could have survived that blast. The main concern now was preventing the storage tanks from rupturing. If that happened, the whole terminal would go up. The workers that were there that night tell of a desperate struggle to keep the massive storage tanks from rupturing, with not much seemingly going in their favour. The fire engine wouldn't start, the fire hoses had been left in a mess, all tangled, handheld fire extinguishers were empty, breathing apparatus was absent, fire hydrants had missing handles and couldn't be opened. Brian McGee, a Gulf Oil employee working that night, recalled the struggle to keep the terminal from blowing. "We were like the living dead. It was soul-destroying. Battling the inferno for what seemed like an eternity, I was filled with sheer dread, expecting at any moment that the tanks would overheat or be punctured and detonate, leaving my wife a widow and my little ones orphans." The fire burning in the remains of the Betelgeuse was estimated to have been around 1,000 degrees centigrade, and the radiant heat coming from the inferno was blistering. Firefighting equipment from the mainland was finally ferried over to the island, and hoses were used to douse the enormous storage tanks, the cooling water hissing and turning to steam on the red-hot metal. About 12 hours after the explosion, the stern section of the Betelgeuse sank, quenching most of the flames and reducing the immediate danger to the storage facility. The bow section remained afloat, although the wreck continued to belch toxic smoke and fumes for the following week, making it impossible for any kind of salvage operation to begin. Eventually, rescue services were able to approach the wreck to recover any remains, and to begin pumping out whatever crude oil remained trapped in the bow section. From a total of 50 people who perished in the explosion, only 27 bodies were recovered. They were buried in the local churchyard overlooking Bantry Bay. In a year-long salvage operation, the sunken parts of the Betelgeuse were refloated and towed away to be scrapped. During this operation, a Dutch salvage diver died, bringing the total number of fatalities linked to the Betelgeuse up to 51. 12 months later, the inquiry into the disaster published its findings and came to the following conclusions. The merchant vessel Betelgeuse was in a poor condition. At the end of her working life, her hull and tanks corroded and leaking. Incorrect pumping off procedures had led to the ship having too much stress placed on her midsection. This uneven ballast, combined with a poor structural condition of the vessel, had led to a structural failure amidships and the subsequent fire. Also, there had been no provision made on board to fill the empty oil tanks with inert gas, and so when the fire reached the empty tanks, the residual flammable gas exploded, tearing the ship in two. The owners of the Betelgeuse, the Total Oil Company, never accepted this finding, instead insisting that the fire started on the jetty and that the disaster was solely the responsibility of the Gulf Oil Company. Gulf, in turn, was criticised for many failings: firefighting equipment that was missing or inoperative, the failure to provide any standby emergency vessel during the unloading procedure, the removal of the jetty footbridge, the absence of the watch officer from his post. The list went on, a litany of complete failure and cut corners. The whole inquiry was controversial. Some witnesses from Gulf testified that the fire and explosion occurred within moments of one another. Others stated that there was at least 25 minutes between the start of the fire and the explosion. Plenty of time for the victims to have been rescued had only the correct safety procedures been followed. There were accusations of perjury, missing evidence, false statements, and falsified log entries. The Irish government was accused of turning a blind eye to safety inspections on account of Gulf being such an important employer in the area. To this day, there is still no definitive account of how events unfolded that night, and to my knowledge, no one was ever held responsible for the Whiddy Island disaster. For many people, the whole inquiry was a whitewash, and many were left dissatisfied. Even now, over 40 years later, families of the dead are still petitioning the Irish government to acknowledge and redress the multiple failings which occurred that fateful night all those years ago. In 1986, the Whiddy Island storage facility was sold by Gulf to the Irish government, who continue to use it to store the bulk of the Irish oil reserves. The scene of the Whiddy Island disaster, the original jetty, still exists, rusting and decrepit, out in the middle of Bantry Bay. A memorial to remember those who died was erected in the Abbey Cemetery in Bantry, and it overlooks the harbour. For most people, the Whiddy Island disaster is a thing of the past, happened over 40 years ago, and yet for some members of the families, it's part of their day-to-day life, the struggle for justice that still continues to this day. There can be few stories of maritime disaster that have proved more controversial than that of the fire on board the SS Morro Castle. On the morning of September the 8th, 1934, the residents of Asbury Park, New Jersey, awoke to a sight that they wouldn't forget in a hurry. Just a short distance from the shore was the enormous, smouldering hulk of a luxury cruise liner. As bedraggled survivors were being pulled from the waves, crowds of people flocked to the scene to witness the still unfolding tragedy. The story of how the Morro Castle came to be there is still shrouded in mystery to this day. Arson, dereliction of duty, possibly even murder, they all figure in a tale that ended with the death of 134 passengers and crew and the total loss of the 11,500-ton ship. Built in 1930, the SS Morro Castle was one of two sister vessels commissioned by the New York-based Ward Line Company. The Morro Castle and the Orient were sister ships which plied the Havana route between New York and Cuba. For as little as $75, passengers could enjoy a round trip with 2 nights accommodation in the Cuban capital. These cruises were incredibly popular, remaining almost always fully booked, even through the early years of the Great Depression. One reason for the enduring popularity of the Havana cruises was the availability of alcohol once the ship had crossed outside the 3-mile limit of US maritime jurisdiction. This was the era of prohibition in the United States, and so the appeal of a booze cruise would have been doubly appealing to the parched citizens of the eastern seaboard. These trips were nicknamed whoopee cruises, and for some passengers it was a non-stop party all the way to Havana and back again. But the glamorous image of the cruise liner shown in the glossy brochure also had a darker side, with more unscrupulous characters frequenting the liners to take advantage of the opportunities afforded from a trip to Cuba. The New York police referred to the boats as the floating whorehouses, and there were many lurid rumours of prostitution, drugs, gun running and gambling on board the vessels. Of course, these rumours did nothing to diminish the popularity of the Morro Castle. On September the 7th, 1934, the Morro Castle was on the final leg of a return trip from Havana. It was the last night on board before returning to New York, but the mood was somewhat soured by the unexpected death of the captain, 55-year-old Robert Wilmot. Earlier in the day, he'd complained of a stomachache and retired to his cabin, only to be found dead an hour later. The ship's doctor could only list the somewhat flimsy explanation of acute indigestion and a possible heart attack as the cause of death. First Officer William Worms assumed command of the vessel for the final part of the voyage. The weather had been steadily worsening during the day, and now the ship was ploughing on through driving rain, strong winds and surging ocean swells. At around 2:30 in the morning of September the 8th, a crewman smelled smoke below deck. Upon further investigation, he traced the cause of the smoke to a closet in the passenger reading room. A fire had started in there, and he rushed back up to the bridge to inform the acting captain. Precious firefighting minutes were wasted, and the fire began to spread. 3 sailors returned to fight the blaze, but by now it was too well established, and they were forced to fall back. Tendrils of smoke began to creep along the corridors of the ship, yet no alarms sounded. On the bridge, Acting Captain William Worms ordered the crew to firefighting stations while he occupied himself with piloting the ship through the heavy seas. The crew dutifully uncoiled the fire hoses and opened the hydrants in readiness. What the crew didn't know was that the system was designed to use only 6 hydrants at a time. By opening too many at once, the water pressure fell quickly, and the fire hoses were rendered useless. Assuming that the fire was being brought under control by the crew, the acting captain, William Worms, kept the vessel steaming on at full speed through the storm, unknowingly fanning the flames and rapidly spreading the fire, even as the crew tried in vain to bring it under control. Smoke was now billowing along the corridors, and many passengers, alerted by the smell of burning, had awoken and were milling around in confusion. A dull, barely audible alarm was ringing somewhere, but there was no announcement from the bridge, and nobody seemed to be around to direct the evacuation to the lifeboats. With no clear instructions, dazed, sleepy and hungover passengers began moving to the rear of the ship, congregating on the open stern decks in an effort to escape the billowing smoke now pouring from the ship's interior. Around this time, Chief Radio Operator George Rogers was woken and summoned from his cabin by his assistant George Alagna. Rogers, quickly grasping the seriousness of the situation, sent Alagna straight to the bridge to get instructions, as an SOS could only be sent with an order from the captain. Arriving on the bridge, Alagna found a scene of complete confusion. The steering had failed, and the ship was now drifting at the mercy of the storm. The chief engineer seemed at a loss as what to do, and William Worms seemed unaware of the true scale of the fire which was now raging on the ship. Worms looked at Alagna, but bizarrely wouldn't acknowledge him or give him an answer regarding his request for the SOS. All the while the blaze increased in intensity and size, the flames spreading along the wooden panelling and decking, glass shattering in the heat, and metal bulkheads warping. The Morro Castle had turned broadside to the wind, and the fire was being fanned with an ever greater intensity. Out on the open decks, passengers began to despair. It was looking like being a choice between jumping into the stormy waters or being burned alive on the ship. Survivor Leroy Kelsey recounted the experience. Black smoke poured down the stairways, and there was a rush of running feet. Flames cracked and roared, and the black windows were shot with red gleams. Were there people in there? We were trapped on the port side of the dying ship, myself, several stewards, and 3 girls too young to die. Back in the radio room, George Rogers could hear nearby vessels radioing the Coast Guard, asking if a ship was on fire, as they could see the glow of a fire in the darkness. Rogers, perched on his chair as the floor was now too hot to touch, choking in the smoke, tapped out the code, CQ, stand by. Alagna returned to the radio room with no clear orders, yelling in annoyance that they're all madmen up there. Rogers decided to wait, but Alagna wasn't as calm. He decided to return to the bridge again. Battling the flames and the smoke, Alagna returned a few minutes later with the OK from Worms. Hopelessly overdue, Choking on fumes and with blistered hands, Rogers finally transmitted the SOS at about 3:20 a.m. His final message, "Hurry, we can't hold out for much longer," was sent just before the generator exploded in the heat. Everything was now happening at once. Desperate passengers trapped on the blisteringly hot stern deck were leaping into the water. People squirmed from portholes on the side of the ship, thick black smoke filling the cabins behind them. Nearby vessels were converging on the Morro Castle after the SOS was sent. William Worms, finally realising that his burning passengers were leaping overboard, restarted the engines in an effort to get the ship closer to the New Jersey shoreline. A few lifeboats were finally launched, most with just a handful of crew on board, and the local Coast Guard vessel joined in the search for passengers adrift in the stormy seas. By morning, there was just a handful of crew left on the stricken vessel. Crowds began to gather on the shore as the burning liner floundered in the waves not far off the New Jersey shoreline. News crews arrived to photograph the bedraggled and stunned survivors as they waded ashore or were picked up by members of the public in small boats. Planes buzzed overhead, giving live action coverage for the radio and newspapers. In the afternoon, a Coast Guard cutter was dispatched to try and tow the Morro Castle back out to sea, but, to the delight of the watching crowd, the tow rope snapped, and the enormous liner, caught in the surf, surged inland and came to rest right on the beach in front of the convention hall. Of the 549 passengers and crew on board the Morro Castle, 134 were killed, and many more were wounded. Some victims were overcome by smoke and perished in the fire. Others were knocked unconscious by the jump from the decks and drowned. Many survived the leap from the ship, but they were drowned anyway in the confusion and the darkness. The very best and worst of humanity was on display that night. Survivors recounted tales of heroism and bravery as complete strangers braved the burning interior of the ship, looking for missing friends and relatives. Crew members gave up their own life jackets to women and children. People risked their lives to help one another in the confusion and panic. On the other hand, there were stories of crew members abandoning their posts, launching near empty lifeboats to save their own skins, and refusing to help panic-stricken families. The worst example of this was Chief Engineer Eben Abbott. Having left his post in the engine room, he then cowered on the bridge until he finally commandeered a lifeboat and ordered it lowered. Ignoring entreaties from the captain and the other crew members, he left the ship, not even bothering to pick up any survivors in the water. He reportedly tore off the gold braid which identified him as an officer in an effort to disguise himself. There were 12 lifeboats on the Morro Castle, with more than enough places for all aboard that night. Only 6 lifeboats were launched, but even so, these 6 had a capacity of over 400 places. In the end, they only took 85 people ashore, most of whom were crew members. The entire sorry tale of the Morro Castle seems to have played out like a tragedy of errors, one mistake compounded by the next. The initial failure to adequately respond to the fire when it was still small, poor training of the crew, failure to sound a general alarm as the fire took hold, the opening of too many hydrants at once, an inexperienced acting captain unknowingly fanning the flames, the open deck design of the ship, the wooden fittings, the failure to send an SOS, so many mistakes and examples of poor judgment. The actual cause of the fire was never pinpointed. The inquiry listed spontaneous combustion as its final finding, but further investigations revealed a darker side to the Morro Castle and her crew. Long working hours and poor pay had led to a 50% average turnover in staff on the vessel. Men were dissatisfied, they had no loyalty to the ship or to the passengers. Many were new to the boat, and they had little or no safety training. Captain Wilmot, the one who died on the return journey, had confided to William Worms that he thought that somebody on the crew was out to get him, and he feared for his life. Many of the surviving officers believed the fire was set intentionally, with eyewitness accounts of blue flames which could not be extinguished by water, indicating that a chemical substance may have been involved. The locker where the fire started was hidden behind a door that only the crew knew about. If that wasn't enough, there'd been a fire on the previous voyage, which was intentionally set, but the crew managed to extinguish. The biggest surprise came with revelations about George Rogers, the hero radio operator who had valiantly stayed at his post throughout the worst of the inferno. An anonymous tip led FBI agents to investigating his background, and what they discovered was Rogers seemed to have an uncanny knowledge of chemistry, an avid interest in bombs and munitions, and he'd been involved with fires and explosions before, often painting himself as the hero of an event when in reality nothing was further from the truth. After the Morro Castle, when Rogers' fame began to fade, he opened up an electronics store which then mysteriously burned down. He next worked as a radio operator for the New Jersey Police Department. Striking up a friendship with a colleague, Vincent Doyle, Rogers soon confided in him a very detailed version of events on the Morro Castle and how the fire had actually started. Becoming suspicious of Rogers' involvement in starting the fire, Doyle pressed him on how he knew so much. Rogers, sensing a danger from Doyle, shortly afterwards built a homemade bomb, lured Doyle into the room where it was planted, and blew it up. Doyle survived, but he was severely injured. Rogers was sentenced to 12 years in prison, but he got parole in 1942 in exchange for enlisting in the army. By 1953, Rogers was back in prison, this time convicted of the double murder of his neighbours to whom he owed money. He died in prison in 1958, never being formally connected to the Morro Castle disaster in any way. The wreck of the Morro Castle remained on the beach Asbury Park for months, close enough to the shore that the visitors could wade out and touch the wreck. Vendors sold postcards of her and souvenirs from the wreck, but eventually the bad smell coming from the ship's interior determined her fate. In March 1935, she was finally hauled off the beach, towed to Baltimore and scrapped. It was the final voyage of the Pride of the Havana Line. The big mystery of the Morro Castle is whether or not George Rogers actually set fire to the ship. His later actions prove that he was an unstable, almost sociopathic character. He certainly had the knowledge and the opportunity to start the fire, but the question is why? What could he possibly have to gain from setting fire to a ship that he was already on? Maybe it was one more chance to play the hero. Maybe he wanted to get his own back on the captain or the crew. He wasn't a popular guy on board. Or maybe the question why is the wrong question to ask with a man like this. After all, this is a guy that made a homemade bomb to kill a friend. Maybe with a guy like Rogers, there is no real reason needed. To borrow the words from a famous film, some men just want to watch the world burn. I once read somewhere that the easiest way for a non-sailor to experience what it's like to actually go sailing is to stand fully clothed in a cold shower and tear up a big pile of money. So, if that doesn't sound like too much fun to you, then you definitely wouldn't have wanted to be anywhere near the Celtic Sea on the night of the 13th of August 1979, when over 300 boats taking part in the Fastnet yacht race ran into what's been described as the perfect freak storm. The Fastnet Race is one of the biggest events in the sailing calendar, a challenging biannual offshore race which tests the skill of sailors in both the open ocean and racing close to the shore. The 600-odd mile route takes the competitors from the Isle of Wight on England's south coast, out past the windswept Cape of Land's End, and across the southern expanse of the Celtic Sea, round the sheer crag of Fastnet Rock, complete with its imposing lighthouse, and then back again, finishing up in Plymouth. It's not for the faint-hearted or particularly inexperienced sailor, this race. The stretch of water from Land's End to the southern coast of Ireland is prone to being hammered by storms and depressions which roll in from the vast open reaches of the Atlantic. These give rise to challenging blue water sailing conditions, which become even more tricky when passing the rocky cliffs and jagged rocks that the route takes you close to. All the time, Hundreds of boats are jostling for position, increasing exponentially the chances of a collision. This race will often push a crew to its limits. Indeed, if the weather forecast is looking particularly grim, as it was in 2007, then the start of the race will be delayed, as it's just simply too dangerous to set off, even for modern yachts. Most of the time, even with all the hazards and the dangers of racing this course, the skill and the experience of the sailors is enough to bring everyone home in one piece. Founded all the way back in 1925, there had only been one fatality in the history of the race, but that was all changed in 1979, when 303 racing yachts set off on Saturday, August the 11th, to compete in the 28 Fastnet Race. Now, for most yachts, the time to complete the race is anywhere between 3.5 to 5 days, which gives plenty of time for the weather to change, so keeping up to date with the latest shipping forecast was imperative. The shipping forecast for August the 11th, that was the day the race began, seemed fairly benign. Southwesterly winds, 4 to 5, increasing to force 6 to 7 for a time. Now, to me that sounds like perfect sailing weather if you've got an experienced crew. So as the 303 yachts carrying over 2,500 sailors set off from the Isle of Wight, they did so in very light winds, and one competitor said it was more like being on holiday than being in a race. But the clear skies were not to last. By Sunday, the racers were becalmed in foggy, windless conditions off Land's End, and it seemed that the race had gotten off to a very slow start. Competitors anticipated an uneventful race that was unlikely to break any records. The impatient crews must have been relieved as the wind began to pick up and the yachts headed out into the Celtic Sea in freshening conditions. What nobody knew at the time was that a deep depression, which had been heightened in intensity by merging with a sharp cold front, had just swung 90 degrees from its original course and was barrelling up out of the Atlantic straight into the path of the Fastnet Race. Now, you've got to remember that back in 1979 there's no GPS, there's no mobile phones, there's no sat-nav. In fact, competitors in the race were only allowed to use a sextant, RDF, a map and a compass. Marine radios back then were very big and expensive, and they were only carried on the bigger yachts. Many of the smaller boats had to rely purely on the weather forecast that was picked up on small handheld FM/AM radios. And if that weather forecast wasn't up to date, a storm could hit and most boats wouldn't have any idea until it was right up on top of them. Sailors described a humid start to Monday the 13th with light, changeable winds that were constantly shifting. The shipping forecast given out at 4 o'clock in the afternoon stated, Sol, Fastnet, Shannon, southwesterly gale, force 8, imminent. However, over 90% of the vessels in the race didn't hear that shipping forecast. For them, the first signs of the freak storm appeared during the night of Monday the 13th of August, when yachtsmen described watching the air pressure barometer falling like a stone, and at the same time waves began piling up and the boats started to be tossed around like corks in a whirlpool. Experienced sailors who'd been in all kinds of other weather conditions had said that they'd never seen anything like it. Wave heights from trough to crest were estimated to have been anywhere between 50 to 60 feet, with waves breaking on the top and cascading avalanches of water down the vertical faces into the troughs below. Now, it might sound like an exaggeration, coming from wet, terrified sailors who were clinging for dear life onto the boats, but this wave height was also verified by the crews of rescue helicopters and the RAF Nimrod plane that took part in the rescue effort. Throughout the night of the 13th and the 14th of August, conditions continued to deteriorate, and the wind was estimated at times to have been blowing at gale force 11. There were massive seas, there were waves piling up in all directions. The boats were being continually slammed down onto their sides, their masts, sails and rigging torn away like wet paper towels. Sailors were thrown out of the boat cockpits and into the ocean, dragged along with safety harnesses like fish hooked on lines. They couldn't do anything other than hold their breath for as long as possible and try and get back onto the boat when they had a lull between the waves. 17-year-old Matthew Sheehan was on board one of the smaller boats that night, the 30-foot Grimalkin. With him was his father David and crew members Jerry Winks, Mick Doyle, Nick Ward and Dave Wheeler. In his own words, he remembers vividly the terror of that night as the little boat was swept along at incredible speed through the storm. The continual howl of the storm was deafening, but the rumble and hiss generated by this outrageous burst of speed rose above the background. A soul-chilling surge of fear swept through us all as we heard the terrifying sound of a wave breaking 40 foot above us. In just a few seconds, the wave was bearing down on us from behind like an avalanche. We dare not look back. There was no escape. There was simply nowhere to go. A split second before the onslaught from astern, the bow disappeared as we nosedived into a wall of water in front. No one had seen that coming, not that it would have done any good if they had. Grimalkin's stern rose until it arched over the bow, and we stood on our nose. A split second later, we were hit from astern by the breaking wave, and we pitch-poled. Now, pitch-poling means that the boat basically does a front somersault. The bow is dug deep into the sea at the front, while a monster wave hits from behind and just flips the boat over, end over end. So anyone who was on the deck was thrown straight out of the boat, and the only hope of surviving was a safety line that connected your harness to something that's clipped onto the boat. But as the storm raged all around, Matthew Sheehan found himself just being towed along under the water. He miraculously came up alongside the Grimalkin just before he ran out of air. All across the Celtic Sea, the storm was hammering the racing yachts. Stricken sailors were floating in the sea, clinging to wreckage, or they'd abandoned ship and taken to inflatable life rafts, hoping to ride out the storm. And it was into these terrible conditions that lifeboats from the Irish coast, Cornwall and South Wales went out on the night of the 13th or 14th of August, putting their own lives at risk to save the hundreds of sailors who were in peril. By dawn, the winds had dropped a bit to only gale force 9, and the Royal Navy helicopters joined the rescue efforts, as well as an RAF Nimrod, a spotter plane that was able to guide the lifeboats to the stricken vessels. Having the aircraft gave the lifeboats a huge advantage, as without them it had been almost impossible to catch sight of anything in the ocean, just simply due to the sheer size of the waves. By now, sailors were not only suffering the fatigue of being constantly hammered by the monstrous waves and repeatedly being capsized, but hypothermia was starting to set in. Previously alert crewmen were now dazed and confused. They were failing to perform necessary tasks like setting off distress flares, or they were forgetting simple things like how to zip up your life jacket or attach your safety harness. Many by now were lethargic, slumped motionless in the cockpits of their battered vessels, unable to save themselves, let alone anybody else. On board the little boat the Grimalkin, the crew was in a dire state. Matt Sheehan's father, David, had been knocked unconscious by flying debris while he was below decks trying to send out a mayday call, and crew members Nick Ward and Jerry Winks were both suffering from hypothermia and struggling to remain conscious. Yet again, their small boat was hit on the side by a monster wave, sending her just rolling over, capsizing the vessel and trapping the crew underneath. Matt Sheehan was unable to move. He was pinned to the side by his safety line, and he was only able to snatch breaths as the Grimalkin rose and fell in the waves. The rescue effort of the 1979 Fastnet Race was the largest peacetime rescue operation in modern British history. For 24 hours, helicopters, Nimrods, lifeboats struggled in terrible conditions to rescue stricken sailors, recover bodies, and tow in abandoned vessels. The rescue was coordinated by the Irish and the UK Coast Guards, with an incredible 4,000 people being involved, including British, Irish and Dutch naval vessels and aircraft. From the 303 boats which started the race, only 86 crossed the finish line. The rest either had to retire and limp to the nearest port, or they were badly damaged and abandoned. At least 5 boats were never seen again. They were presumed sunk, and a total of 21 people lost their lives in the storm. Included amongst the dead were 2 from the Grimalkin, Matt Sheehan's father David and crewman Jerry Winks. Meteorologists who later studied the storm concluded that the deep depression which formed had kind of been turbocharged by a column of cold air which apparently just crashed down from the stratosphere and broke the storm into 2. This produced freak conditions with enormous waves, very confused seas, and winds that were gusting apparently up to 80 knots. Jerry Butler, one of the lighthouse keepers on the Fastnet Rock that night, witnessed firsthand how the tragedy unfolded. It was such a horrific event. The storm just popped up out of the blue, and it blew with such rage and strength that the sea was mountainous. During the course of the entire night, it was yacht after yacht after yacht getting into trouble and calling for help. Jerry recalls seeing the crest of some of the waves hitting about 20 feet below the lighthouse balcony. If you look at that photograph, it almost beggars belief how big those waves must have been. Now, these terrible conditions were compounded by the almost non-existent communication systems on most boats. There was inadequate safety gear, and people were sailing in boats that were simply not designed or built to just take that amount of punishment. However, the overriding factor was the terrible weather and the sheer ferocity of the storm in which the sailors found themselves. As one captain said later on, it didn't matter how big your boat was or how experienced you were not in control that night. That night, it was the cruel sea that was controlling you. Indeed, some of those involved in the 79 Fastnet race have gone on to do many round-the-world trips, other offshore races, and extreme sailing challenges, and they still maintain to this day that the weather that they encountered that night in the Celtic Sea was without doubt the worst that they've ever seen. Needless to say, the loss of life prompted major changes to the Fastnet race and a general rethink of the risk assessments made when allowing boats to enter the race. And to my knowledge, there's been no further fatalities during any of the subsequent Fastnet races. But then again, there's never been another Fastnet race running conditions to compare with that one of 79. Even with the terrible loss of life and the overall disaster scenario of the race, there was still a winner. And funnily enough, it was Ted Turner, the bloke who founded CNN. He skippered the winning yacht and he completed the course in 3 days and 8 hours. Have you ever heard the saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions? Well, that phrase could certainly be used when talking about the disaster of the SS Eastland, a passenger steamship which rolled over in just 20 feet of water while still moored at the side of the Chicago River. The resulting tragedy ranks as the second deadliest maritime accident in US history, and it happened in part due to the addition of extra lifeboats and life rafts that were intended to make the vessels safer. July the 24th, 1915. The SS Eastland is one of 5 vessels that have been booked to take workers from Chicago's Western Electric Company on the annual outing to Hawthorne Picnic. It was a short trip across the southern end of Lake Michigan to Washington Park, with the promise of a fun-filled day out. It was a big event, a Saturday off work, a chance for the blue-collar families to get out of the city for a day, and a perfect opportunity for young working-class singles to meet and mingle outside of the confines of the factory. It was a very popular outing, with more than 7,000 tickets having been sold, and ticket holders had been advised to get down to the dock early to avoid missing the boat. The SS Eastland was moored in the heart of downtown Chicago, just upstream from the Clark Street Bridge. She was the first vessel to begin taking on passengers that day, with boarding starting at around 6:30 in the morning. The weather was inauspicious, grey and drizzling, and so many passengers headed straight below decks to get out of the damp conditions. With so many day trippers to load, boarding was a speedy affair, and in under an hour the Eastland had reached her capacity of 2,500 passengers. The official figure given for the number of souls on board was 2,573, although other reports later stated that the actual number could have been over 3,000. Now, during the boarding process, the Eastland had already shown some signs of instability. At around 7:10 a.m, she listed over to port, but then righted herself. On board, passengers showed no undue alarm. The mood was one of excitement and anticipation, and the ship rolling around a bit only added to the fun. Despite the obvious instability, the captain of the Eastland, Harry Pedersen, decided to carry on with the boarding anyway, and preparations to get the ship underway carried on as normal. By 7:20 AM, she was listing to port again, but this time the list gradually worsened. By now the gangplanks were up, the ship was full and just about ready to set sail. And it was at this point that the list to port reached a critical limit, and water began pouring in on the open gangways closest to the waterline. The fate of the Eastland was now sealed, and within a couple of minutes the ship had listed beyond 45 degrees, at which point she quickly rolled over onto her side. Being in only 20 or so feet of water, she didn't fully capsize or sink, but she lay flat on her side in the river. The speed and the inertia of the final roll had flung many of the passengers who were on the open upper deck into the water. Like ants brushed from a table, the surface of the river was black with struggling, crying, frightened, drowning humanity. Dock workers and members of the public on the quayside immediately rushed to help, throwing wooden crates and planks of wood into the water to help the floundering masses, but it was a scene of panic and chaos. Helen Reaper, a nurse working for Western Electric, described the scene. A few were swimming. The rest were floundering about, some clinging to a little raft that had floated free, others clutching at anything that they could reach, at bits of wood, at each other, grabbing each other, pulling each other down. And the screaming. The screaming was the most horrible of all. For those on board, below deck, the situation was even more terrifying. As the ship heeled over towards 45 degrees, people and objects began sliding across the floor. A grand piano, heavy furniture, and some large refrigerators broke free of their fixings, crashing through the crowd and crushing passengers beneath them. As the ship rolled, survivor George Goyette described what he saw. A crowd of men, women and children came slipping and sliding and sprawling down with a mass of lunchboxes, milk bottles, chairs, rubbish of every sort on top of them. They came down in a floundering, screaming mass, and as the boat turned completely over on its side, they crashed into the stairs and were carried away. Now I can't even begin to imagine how awful it must have been for those people. The crush of bodies on top of you, the water rising up beneath you as you lie there pinned, it must have just been awful. The people of Chicago displayed heroism in spades that day. Paperboy Abraham Blumenthal dived in and began pulling women and children to shore with no thought for his own safety. Bridge guard Frank Northup jumped into an empty lifeboat and single-handedly saved 23 people. 3 other men, Charlie Hart, Johnny Benson and F.D. Fredericks, none of whom had any experience with boats, commandeered an empty tug, figuring if it had an engine, they could drive it. They got the tug going, got it out into the river, and were able to rescue over 50 people. Many of the passengers who were on the upper deck had managed to climb up onto the exposed side of the ship as she went over. Seeing the mass of humanity huddled on the upturned hull, John O'Meara, captain of the tug Kenosha, swiftly manoeuvred his boat into position alongside the Eastland, creating a kind of a floating bridge as a means of reaching dry land. In this way, some of the lucky ones were able to get onto the quayside without even getting their feet wet. Among these lucky ones was the captain, Harry Pedersen. You know, the man who had failed to give any alarm and who'd continued with the boarding even after the Eastland had shown obvious signs of being top-heavy. More and more boats arrived on scene to help, but as the minutes turned to hours, those involved noticed that they were no longer rescuing desperate passengers from the river. Instead, they were now pulling only lifeless bodies from the water. The milling rescue boats began to instead resemble floating hearses, the bodies piling up on the decks, as more and more were dragged from the water. There's a short piece of newsreel footage actually showing this, link in the description. Again, viewer discretion, it's pretty morbid stuff, although it does bring home to you the awfulness of the situation that day in the river. Meanwhile, shouts, screams and banging could still be heard coming from inside the ship, and welders who had been working in the nearby engineering firms had dragged their cutting gear out onto the exposed hull. It was agreed to cut out sections from the steel along the side of the hull in order to free the surviving passengers, as suffocation was becoming a real threat for those still trapped below decks. In an act of almost unbelievable callousness, Captain Harry Pedersen and some of his crew climbed back onto the hull and ordered the welders to stop, whining that the welders were ruining his ship. As he continued interfering with the rescue effort, he was finally arrested by the Chicago police, partly for his own safety, as some of the welders had stated that they would lynch him if he didn't get lost. Apparently, he took a few hard punches to the head from members of the public as he was being led away. The welders opened up holes along the upturned hull, and many men, women and children were hauled to safety through these improvised escape hatches, their lives saved by the quick thinking of those men working on the quayside. Volunteer divers arrived on scene to search the flooded parts of the Eastland, although their hope of finding anyone left alive dwindled with each passing hour. Time and time again these divers went down, negotiating the flooded parts of the ship to recover the dead. One young man, just 17 years old, arrived on the quay, stripped down to his trunks and dived in. He was an excellent swimmer by the name of Reggie Bowles, and that day he recovered over 40 victims, going without equipment deep into the bowels of the ship where the other divers couldn't reach. He was eventually forced to stop diving when it became apparent he was totally exhausted and he himself was in danger of drowning. The veteran divers nicknamed him the Human Frog for his efforts that day. Over the following days, volunteers gave way to recovery efforts by professional divers. They were brought in to clear the ship and check the riverbed downstream. The final death toll was a staggering 844 victims. The average age of the victims was just 23, as many of the dead were children and teenagers. Among the dead were entire families, and there were many cases where just one family member survived, but all others perished. The psychological toll wrought by the disaster must have been immense, not only for the survivors and families of those lost, but also for those involved in the rescue and recovery effort. There are anecdotes of experienced boat captains and hardened police officers breaking down in tears when they thought that no one was looking. As reporters began looking into the facts surrounding the tragedy, it became clear that the Eastland had a troubled history of near capsizes. Launched in 1903 and originally designed to carry only 500 passengers, she was on record as having almost capsized in 1904 and again in 1906. There was no doubt that she was a poorly designed boat. Her designer had been a young man barely out of university who apparently had to constantly go back to his old tutor for advice during her construction. The Eastland was also the first and only passenger ship built by that shipyard. Being designed for travel on the Great Lakes, she had a very shallow draft, floating on what was basically a flat-bottomed hull. Add to this inadequate ballast tanks, and you ended up with a top-heavy, unstable vessel. One sailor familiar with the Eastland described her as being like a bicycle. She was stable once she got going, but wobbly as hell when stood still or going slowly. And to cap it off, legislation had been passed after the sinking of the Titanic, which mandated that all passenger vessels had to have adequate provision of life-saving equipment for all passengers. To comply with this new law, the Eastland was fitted with extra lifeboats, 37 life rafts, and nearly 3,000 life jackets. In total, this added around an extra 40 to 60 tons of weight, and all of it was placed on the upper deck. During the passing of this new law, which was called the La Follette Seamen's Act, warnings had been given that shallow draft vessels could turn turtle because of the extra weight, but these concerns were unfortunately given little thought and ultimately dismissed. Ironically, when the Eastland rolled over, not one life jacket had been handed out, nor were any lifeboats or rafts launched. In the end, it took 24 years of legal wrangling for the 7 inquiries to finalise their findings. Only one man, Engineer Eriksson, was held to blame. He was accused of mismanaging the ballast tanks during the boarding that day. Eriksson had died during the lengthy legal process, and many saw him as a convenient fall guy for the enquiries. As for Captain Harry Pedersen, although seemingly guilty of negligence, he had no charges brought against him. The owners of the vessel also got off scot-free. What little compensation was made available went mostly to the salvage company that towed the Eastland out of the Chicago River. The families and survivors received almost nothing. After all, unlike the Titanic, there were no rich or famous passengers on board. It was just mostly Polish, Czech and Hungarian working class families, a fact which some historians believe had led the Eastland tragedy to being almost completely forgotten by history. Indeed, in all the books I have on disasters, even specifically maritime tragedies, the Eastland is never mentioned once. And as for the Eastland herself, well, she was purchased by the US Navy in 1917, she was renamed the USS Wilmette and was used as a training vessel and gunboat until 1946 when she was finally scrapped. Today, the Eastland disaster is remembered by a simple plaque at the site of the tragedy in downtown Chicago.